Welcome to Every Church a Peace Church. I'm Emmanuel Charles McCarthy, and I'm again substituting this week for Don Edwards. And we will continue our discussion that we began last week with John Carmody, Director of the Center for Christian Nonviolence in Wilmington, Delaware, who is also a person who is deeply involved for a good part of his life since doctoral studies in science with the whole area of brain development and neuroscience. Welcome, John.
Good to be here.
Let's pick up our discussion from last week, in which we mentioned that there is the mind of Christ, and then there is the mind of, say, the Marine. And these are two different mind styles. They're two different, if you will, structures of the brain. One, the mind of Christ, is involved with compassionate care, rejection of violence, rejection of loving of enemies. And the other is involved with violence, if you will, the lack of empathy for victims, just the opposite. One is involved with learning how to be a caring person. The other is involved with learning how to be a killing person towards people. And that these two different minds can be shown in science to have to be created differently. What you do for one to create one, you can't do for the other. Right. And yet you, when you were in the Marine Corps, you said that your church, the people in your church, the chaplaincies, all left you with the impression that the mind of Christ and the mind of the Marine were pretty much the same mind, and were pretty much, if you did the Marine process, you were doing the Christian process. Now, let's continue on that point. You said passingly, but I'd like to pick up on it here, that the military is deeply involved with investigating and participating in the whole world of neuroscience, the whole world of how the brain develops and how it works. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think a starting point would be the age at which the military deems an adolescent ready to enlist and actually requires males to sign up for the draft. So that age is 18. But that doesn't square with science, because if one were to look at, for example, the anthropological data and the brain scan data, one would find that there are two major areas of the brain that are underdeveloped when an adolescent is 17 or 18 years old.
And what are they?
Well, the one area we've talked about a little bit, and that's the prefrontal cortex.
What takes place there?
Well, there are executive functions that take place there.
Like what?
Like initiating, planning, sustaining attention, regulation of emotions, shifting from task to task, organizing action, doing things like inhibiting reactions. And then there are other even more involved areas that have to do with the expression of empathy, compassion, care, understanding, abstract thinking, logic, creativity. These are all functions that are carried out by this highest area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex.
And this is the part of the brain that human beings have that animals don't share it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. This makes us different.
So at 18 years old, this part of the brain is not fully developed.
No, it's immature.
Immature.
So what happens is that there is a lower brain area called the amygdala that is known as the seat of emotions. So during the period of time that the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, immature, that is this part of the brain, the brain gives over decision-making powers to a great extent to the amygdala.
And what does the amygdala do?
Well, we said it was the seat of emotions. And so what happens is that the decisions that take place in the amygdala are oftentimes dependent on the emotion of the situation. And so this can lead to things like the inability to interpret anger and fear. It can also affect self-control, and it can also affect the regulation of emotions. This is some of the sequelae that can follow from using this highly emotional area to make decisions.
So in the mind of the 18-year-old, 19-year-old that's being recruited, what is it that is the neurological plan of the military? What are they trying to reach in that mind?
Well, the military plan is to reach the amygdala because it's the area that's involved in decision making. So this person has to make a very important decision. But it must be remembered that in the military there's an ethos of individualism, and this extends into the recruiting process where they try to separate the individual from his or her support group. And so sometimes parents don't even know that their son or daughter is being recruited. In fact, they don't even know that they've signed up many times.
So they're focusing on the individual as the individual 18 or 19-year-old,
Right.
playing to this first of all, developed piece in him, the amygdala, but also knowing that he does not have the fully developed higher powers to evaluate what they're doing to him.
And also the amygdala is really not fully developed either, so it's not even a good driver for decision makings based on emotion, but it's what they have at that point in time at 17 or 18. And the recruiters, as you well know, have access to school records.
Why do they have access to school records?
Well, that was a provision that was allocated or made available as part of No Child Left Behind.
Okay.
And so if they go to football games or soccer games, they can pick out people that are very athletic, very well coordinated, very strong, you know, that know how to work as a team. And they want to find out more about this person, so they just, you know, get the name and then get the records. And so they have all this information, and then they can start the recruiting process. But there's another thing that's going on in the brain of the adolescent, the 17, 18, 19-year-old. And that is that although there are 100 billion neurons in the brain, during this period there are neurons that actually need to be gotten rid of because we really want to refine the flow of information through the pathways in the central nervous system in the brain. And so there is a process that the body enters into. It's a natural process of actually killing off neurons.
All right.
So they call it, in this stage, the pruning of neurons.
All right.
Well, during this process, the adolescent is vulnerable to drugs. For example, nicotine, alcohol, and other addictions like pornography and violence.
Why?
Well, there is a relationship between this pruning of neurons and the ability of the brain to withstand the enticement, you know, that these things would bring. So what is actually happening to the brain is that it is made more vulnerable to actual participation in this kind of activity, drug-seeking behavior, doing drugs, you know, pornography.
And how does this fit in with the military recruiting?
Well, the addictions are actually stressors on the prefrontal cortex, and so they can impair the development of the prefrontal cortex itself. So if you're looking at a 17 or 18-year-old who's been involved in these activities, then the prefrontal cortex isn't even as far along as it should have been because these addictions are stressors and impair, get in the way of that process. And the other thing that's going on as far as the adolescent brain is concerned is that is before it's mature, is that adolescents are attracted to activities that are high excitement, low effort. And we have to remember that the adolescent brain is particularly impressionable. Now, if we back up a minute to what I said before, just the whole notion of activities. When we want to change an area of the brain, that is, when we want to change the wiring in the brain, we need to enter into certain specific types of activities. And then you have that process of patterned, repetitive stimulation. Right? So activities repeated over and over again fall into that category of actually changing already existing neural organization.
In the brain.
In the brain, or interfere with neural organization that is not taking place, because you have to have specific connections being made, and you have to have networks being set up in a specific way in order for the prefrontal cortex to function properly, in order for any part of the brain to function properly.
So as I think and as I do things actually in life, I mean, as I actually do them,
Right.
I am changing the structure of the brain at some very serious level.
Right.
So when I'm brought into military training, this is what they're about. They're about changing the brain. Because if in doing it, by putting you through other human activities, whether it's whatever the activities are they do in military training.
And it's important to remember that, you know, as we've already stated, that this adolescent brain is particularly impressionable, and not impressionable in the normal generic sense. That is, not impressionable as, wow, that's a nice car, you know, wow, you can sing well, wow, you're beautiful, that kind of, so you make an impression on people by, you know, your physical attributes or your talents. When we talk about this kind of impression, we're talking about impressing actual wiring circuits in the brain that will allow that prefrontal cortex or the amygdala, but the prefrontal cortex primarily, since we're addressing that as the big thinking area of the brain, that you're going to be impressing, literally stamping, hardwiring neural pathways in the brain that could exist forever and not be changed unless you have some countervening activity that's going to subsume the place of that track.
This reminds me of something that prior to the Christian just war theory that started with approximately St. Augustine in the 4th century, prior to that, where war was made something that was good, almost universally, when a country went to war, whether it was a tribe or whether it was the Greeks or when a country went to war, those that they send out to war, before they would allow them to come back into the society, the civil society, they would have incredibly difficult purgation rites. That is, they would go through processes that were, in many cases, horrible. But now that I think of it, in terms of what you're saying is, they had to be rewired for war, and then they had to go through activity to rewire them again so that they wouldn't be bringing the mind of war back into the civil society.
Right.
Whereas once we have war justified by Christianity as good, you don't need any purgation rites, because the mind that you put on in the Marine Corps, you just bring it back into the society. So what I'm trying to raise here is this. You're a scientist. If we were to desire, that is, by we I mean the Christian churches, if we were to desire to help young people from preschool, 18 till the mind is fully developed, which you said was about 24 or 5, if we were to desire to have them put on the mind of Christ, wouldn't it require the same kind of intensity as Marine training? The same kind of, not the same things, but the same kind of going through activities that would be consistent with the activities of Christ, just like the Marine training going through activities that are consistent with John Wayne or whatever, in order to put on that mind. And without that kind of training, you don't redo the architecture of the mind into the architecture of the mind of Christ.
Well, I think the term to use is nurturing. because the structure of the brain is generally determined genetically. You know, that is the basic pattern which these nerves develop and the general locations in which they're located. But the active brain, you know, in the adult is actually an internal reflection of the external environment. So when you talk about training versus nurturing, what we have to do is we have to go back and look at even what's going on prenatally as far as the relationship between the mother and the child are concerned. Because the fluid and the blood supply, you know, that the infant is exposed to, that the developing child is exposed to, can actually change the brain at that point in time. For example, if the mother's under stress, high cortisol levels in the baby's brain affect the migration of neurons in the cortex, so basically it doesn't go as far as it should. So, if the brain structure and function is dependent upon nurturing, then that's what we must be about. So the whole idea of using dominative power in raising a child, the whole idea of threat, fear, intimidation,
right,
creating that environment around the child in order the child conforms to whatever norm you have established to be the family norm. And so basically what you're doing is driving the development of that brain down to the reptilian level.
Now, what about military training? Because that seems to be all threat and fear and using it or exposed to it or...
Right. Well, that's just a recapitulation. If the child has experienced that early in life, it has the same... It's not as harmful as it is early on. If it happens early on, if the child is hit or neglected, then you have major changes take place. Because remember we said that even the lower parts of the brain have to be developed before you can have a... Okay. So in this particular case, in the case of the military and training, what they're doing is the ability to shut down empathic pathways, even if they were there, and revert to the lower pathways. But so
the nurturing that goes on in the military for the average fellow that goes in as a private is not a nurturing of the higher brain functions.
No.
However, if I remember correctly, what you said in our last show was that the higher brain functions, the compassion, the empathy, the creativity, and so forth and so on, those are the last developed. That is, the lower brain functions animals have. The higher brain functions only human beings have. Compassion and empathy. It seems to me that the mind of Christ is involved with the higher brain functions of the human being, developing them. Whereas the military nurturing and the war and the violence is nurturing the other side. Is it possible to say that the problem is not war, the problem is military training? That is, without people trained to show no compassion, with people trained on the other side to kill or to dominate, what you've got a situation where what changes the person from being a kid in the schoolyard at 18 years old playing basketball to spraying someone a year later with a flamethrower is the nurturing process in between.
That's correct. And it can happen very quickly because we have seen studies that were done, for example, with violent video games. And when they look at brain activity of normal children who play violent video games, they are the same as in children who have disruptive behavior disorder. So just something as seemingly innocuous as violent video games can cause these changes since they're vulnerable during this period of time, so that their brain doesn't look like a normal child's brain. This is a normal child. There's nothing psychologically wrong, but they're doing the violent video games, and now they have, brain activity that resembles that of someone who has disruptive behavior disorder. And there was even a study done that coined the term video game brain.
Yes.
And one of the things that they found in that study was that these higher brain functions were used very little, if at all. And there was also a problem with emotional control when one was playing the game.
And like so many of those school killings, at least a lot of them, where the killing was done by kids that put bullets right through the forehead.
Right.
You don't put bullets through the forehead. You got to be a marksman to put bullets through the forehead. And when they look back, they found out you got extra points in these video games for putting the bullets through the. That's where they learned that kind of accuracy. But here's what I like to raise with you, John, is we all say Jesus saves. He saves, all right. And we agree with that. The question is, how does he save? When Jesus explicitly appeals to the higher functions of the human being, compassion and love and kindness towards all, not just to the in-group. And when, on the other hand, training goes on that appeals to the lower functions, the reptilian functions, the animal functions of the human being. Is it possible that this process of salvation that we call Jesus saves, is it possible that we're missing it altogether, that what's taking place is that we are supposed to be building the process, putting people through the nurturing to build that higher brain function, which we can show by science is not built in the military, which we can show by science has to have an entirely different nurturing apparatus than military apparatus, so that when we send our children into the military training, we're not participating in the process that Jesus set up, the process of compassion and love. We're not building the mind of Christ. The question then becomes, are we participating with the process of Jesus saving? Well, we know, don't we, that when you become desensitized to people, you are certainly not acting like Jesus acted, who was compassionate in the extreme, even to the enemy. So I guess my question is here. When we look at the military, to go right back to where this conversation started, are they employing the knowledge of neuroscience as it is today, right at the structure of the brain? Are they employing it as a mechanism to recruit kids into a nurturing process that is contrary to the nurturing process that would put on the mind of Christ?
I think that's unequivocally true, because if you look at the product that the boot camp wants to deliver to the commander in the field in Iraq, it's not going to be a person who's hesitant, about following the orders of his, immediate squad leader or platoon commander or company commander. In other words, he has to turn over his thinking. Not that they can't think and figure things out. It's this wonderful capacity to analyze and to participate in logic are still there. But what happens in the nurturing is that brain doesn't ever get, to where it should have been to be the reflection of what God had intended to be this quintessential part of the human being, that is this part of the brain that can always choose to be kind, always choose to be compassionate, always choose to be merciful. And that is the default position. So if you look at the functioning of this part of the brain, this is what this part of the brain was designed to do. And all the analyzing and creativity are there to think of better ways to do this.
So that a person who developed a lower part of the brain became addicted to sexuality, let's say, or addicted to heroin.
Right.
That person could still have a genius mind as far as logic, but he would be using or she would be using it in order to be a sexual predator, in order to get their heroin. Whereas if the nurturing was in terms of compassion and care, that genius logical mind would be now employed to figure out how to make life better for people.
How to save, that is, how to overcome evil and death.
How to overcome evil and death. How to be Christ-like in a world that is very, very un-Christ-like.
Because if someone is immersed in evil, someone is being tortured, someone has had their whole property destroyed, someone has watched their children be dismembered as a result of a Klan coming through with machetes. And in fact, the same thing happened in Vietnam. After the inoculation of Vietnamese kids, some of the Viet Cong would come through. And so this kind of evil, this kind of suffering that people undergo is what we want to save people from. And you can't save them by using military force. You can only save them by using kindness, mercy, and compassion.
And you can't save them by military force because the very process that you're saving them with is building the mind into just repeating that.
Yep.
And this is what they mean by violence is contagious.
Yes.
You respond to violence with violence, and you're building a mind to respond to violence with violence. You're losing empathy. The higher capacities are shutting down. And as you said, they're shutting down every time you go through the process, patented, repetitive response. They're shutting down all the more as time passes.
So the more time you devote to your reptilian brain with this aggression, rage, violence, fear, anger, the more that's going to dominate your decision-making process, because all these areas of the brain are interconnected. And so it's not like a three-part brain, it's a triune brain.
And with less than a minute, what about the poor human being that finds himself killing and destroying people in war, then comes back into civil society and realizes these were human beings. These were people's children. They lied to me about what Christ would do. What about that mind? Is there any possibility for changing back?
There is possibility for changing back because the brain remains forever plastic. So it's amenable to being rewired.
So repentance is real.
Repentance is real.
Thank you. Thank you for listening this particular program, these two programs on neuroscience and nonviolence. Please tune in again next week and hear Don as he interviews another person interested in every church becoming a peace church. God bless you.